When I was younger, I kind of wanted to be a bit of everything. So I would read a really excellent medieval fantasy fiction book, and I think, okay, my goal in life is to be a medieval historian. And then maybe the next month, I'd read a book about copyright law in the digital age. And this was middle school. I was kind of a weird kid, but I was like, okay, I want to be an intellectual property lawyer. That's definitely the most exciting path I could have. But for a really long time, the thing that felt right as a life pursuit, the thing that I would wake up and kind of squirrel away some time at the computer to do, was creative writing. And I was pretty convinced for a while that I would follow that. So I grew up in California, and there's a state-funded summer school for the arts. And I went there one summer for creative writing. And I remember specifically looking at the application forms for doing art and design there and scoffing because I had this clear idea that I couldn't draw and that just wasn't going to be my thing. And this photograph is from one of the creative writing classes we had where we would read great work, discuss it, share our own work, critique it. And the summer school is located on the CalArts campus. And I remember ducking into the library there and stumbling across a whole cluster of design books. And I remember coming across this one book, Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. And it had this really friendly orange cover. And I thought, okay, I'll just poke into it, see what it's like. Hi there. And I fell in love with typography. And so I'd expected to spend my summer, typing out all these pages. And instead, I was looking at these poetry books, and I was focusing on the letter forms instead. I spent all my time typesetting the little creative writing assignments I had instead of actually doing them. So that was really exciting to me. I didn't think of myself before that as someone who is artistic or visually creative just because I had this idea of I can't draw hands, I can't shade things, so it's not going to be the place for me. But typography seemed very safe and accessible. It was a very rigorous system, but it also felt like there was room to be creative. And so that was the summer that introduced me to design. I finished that summer, felt very fulfilled, and then headed home and made plans to do, honestly, something different. I switched my life goals again, and I decided I wanted to be a computer scientist. And I think this was something my parents were way more comfortable with than all my other life ambitions up until that point. So I went to Carnegie Mellon for computer science, immersed myself in it. It's really not a field that has the most accessible information visualizations. And so I was kind of swimming through my CS education and then at the same time just picking up all these design exercises on the side. So I was really involved in organizations that supported getting more women into computer science, and maybe they'd have an event or they'd have a website that needed updating. And I'd help out with that and then kind of try to poke in my own design opinions, things like that. And I started feeling like I wanted to not necessarily flee from computer science as a discipline, but certainly as a career. And I really enjoyed the mindset that came from the field, but I was much more interested in the practice of design. So after a few years of all this stuff, I realized, well, CMU has a great design department. And so I started sending a lot of overly earnest, overly enthusiastic emails to professors at my university and people in the industry, and basically asking, how can I be like you? How can I do the type of work that you do? And that sparked my first really humbling design moment. I talked to a professor who was a very no-nonsense, gruff kind of person initially, and he challenged me. He was quite skeptical, and he asked, why do you want to learn design? How sincere are you about it? And I think that was honestly fair of him because my understanding of design looked like this. It was fonts, color palettes, it was kind of all this stuff that looked pretty, that seemed compelling. And I only had the faintest idea of what design was beyond that. And I think it's fortunate that he challenged me because I kind of got a little touchy and I was like, okay, fine, I'll show you what I can do. So I decided to read about design as much as possible. Since reading is what sparked my interest in creative writing, it's what refined my taste in what good writing looked like, so I thought it would work for design too. And so I read about typography and grids. I moved this book collection from dorm room to dorm room, and I came back to the advisor and said, put in the time, thought about this, this is still something I'm interested in, and he challenged me again, and he asked, and he said, basically, reading about the theory is great, but you need practice to animate your theory. You need to be doing something with all that. And I had at this point all these fuzzy, intuitive ideas about what design could be, but I didn't have a great understanding of the craft. And I'd gotten over my initial fear of, being a visual person, like doing artistic things. But at the time, I was still very hung up on doing digital work, barely touched physical mediums. And so I decided to do what felt like the most physical kind of material demanding thing possible, which was calligraphy. And it's interesting, when I was putting together my slides, I realized I have no photos of finished calligraphy work that looks good, but I have hundreds of photos of my mistakes, which is maybe indicative of what my calligraphy experience was. You know, you're like kerning in real time. You put your pen down and the ink gets there and you're like, oh my God, everything's over. This page is ruined. It's too close to the previous letter. And so that was tough, but it got me over my fear of doing things, of practicing design and kind of experiencing all of that theory for myself. And so at this point in time, my sense of design had shifted. I realized if you call them typefaces and not fonts, people take you more seriously, good stuff like that. Throw in like the word gestalt every once in a while. But this whole time I was still studying computer science, and splitting my time between these two topics I found very compelling. And I kind of want to talk about the challenges that arose out of that. A big struggle, I think, was comparing myself to like two or more standards of what success was. And I don't know if other people in the audience struggle with this, but it was something that I was very anxious about for the longest time, kind of looking at the design work out there, looking at amazing print work, web work, digital work, and feeling like I wasn't quite measuring up. And then I was pursuing this other discipline that I was really fascinated by, and then thinking, well, but I'm doing all this design stuff, so I can't become a better programmer, can't become a better discrete mathematician. I'm just splitting my time between all these things. And I had this very strong fear that I was doing too much and maybe I would just end up being mediocre at everything. What I managed to do to cope with that, I made this visualization a few years ago. It was a large poster format, incredibly expensive to print out, but it was essentially a way of kind of understanding all these different experiences I'd had within these different disciplines, like doing the creative writing stuff, the computer science stuff, and seeing how that informed my work as a designer. So each of these bands was supposed to be a kind of identity facet. And then drawing from my creative writing experience, I would write these little kind of like memoir-like vignettes discussing interests I'd had in the past, the like fascinations they sparked. And I really consciously wanted to reframe my fear that I was spreading myself too thin, that all these other interests and concerns were a waste of time. And I wanted to feel that the non-design stuff I was doing was not like stealing my ability to be a good designer, but was informing and expanding upon that. So I tried to see them as events that shaped the kind of design work I wanted to do. And there are some opportunities, I think, to working like between these spaces. I think many of you are probably like design focused, but if there are other kind of like interests that have been kind of like percolating in the back of your mind, I would encourage you to push out into those as well. Because one thing I found is that being in spaces that were kind of thinly occupied by designers, I would kind of show up and go, I'm really interested in design, interested in type, interested in digital product design, and I would actually find a lot of really interesting opportunities to do good work and do fun things. Back in my creative writing days, I had a screenwriting teacher who was studying at Tisch, and she talked about how being around a lot of aspiring actors, where she was the one screenwriter they knew, meant that if she ever wrote a script, they would all want to act it out, and she would get to see her work actually performed. And I think that what this really tells me is that, like, if you're an interdisciplinary person, you're always going to be in spaces where, like, maybe you only have like a little bit of experience in a field you care about, but you're automatically the expert if there's no one else around, which is really thrilling. So one of my internships at Artsy, how that happened was that they reached out to a few software engineering people to just like get to know kind of like potential hires, I guess. And those software engineering people knew me as like that one girl in our classes who's like really dorkly obsessed with this design stuff. And so they were able to connect me to those opportunities. I've had other experiences kind of trying to be more involved in communities that are discussing like technology and ethics, where I was able to show up and say like, I'm a technologist who's also interested in design. I'd like to help out with promoting events, kind of like helping get a message out there. And so I think that work has been really compelling for me just by being in spaces where people are desperate for designers and maybe don't know that many. Another struggle, I think, is being a designer when people aren't quite sure what design is. So another humbling moment happened when I began working more professionally, and then I would get people saying things like this. This is our designer. She makes our app look pretty. Or they might go like, oh, here's where the designers sit. They, make posters and t-shirts, and they do our UI and like polish it up. And, I felt uncomfortable with this because I'd been really fascinated with all these like lofty ideals of design as this important, meaningful thing. And I was reading and kind of like having discussions with other designers about like the potential for design to change conversations, to change communities, to, maybe like change the world, however that might manifest. But I also felt this uncomfortable sense of identification with these statements. Because there was a time early on when I was like, oh, design, that's like the thing you do when you're artistic and you polish things up and you choose like different fonts you download off of DefFonts or something. And I would hear this from the software engineers around me, and I think I almost was one of them, and then I found design. So how can I communicate the things I've learned about design, the value I've gotten from it, to them so that they can see the complexity and richness of the work that designers can do? I came across this idea. It's common among educators, I think, that people have different kinds of literacy. So we're really familiar with the sense of literacy as communicating with words and language. For the longest time, through the computer science community, I was immersed in this idea of numeracy, of quantitative reasoning, reasoning with mathematical concepts, and I think a lot of the people I worked with really heavily prioritized this, and this was the language they understood. And then there's visual literacy. And for all these kinds of literacy, I think there's a difference between reading it and writing it. So for visual literacy, I would say that many people can read a visual scene, they're responding to it, they're understanding what's going on. And what I wanted to do was kind of communicate to people what it's like to write things visually. Actually designing something, being able to articulate this is what's valuable, this is what's not valuable, and then presenting that to people in a format they can consume with their eyes. And I started thinking about those moments way back when I was first getting into design, learning more about it and developing a deeper sense of the industry, and how I learned to do that. I think my sense of design is always evolving, but right now it's currently more along the lines of, the craft obviously, but also communicating the craft, communicating the intentionality around it. And then also trying to get the perspective of the users I design for, the other people I work with who are not designers, but still I hope want to be invested in the design, want to know what's going on with it. And I think a big part of this was shifting my perspective of design as the goal. The goal is not the beautiful thing and making that happen. The goal is making the hopefully beautiful thing that is a method of achieving some larger, more important goal. And so I felt that design had to be more something that wasn't just a thing I did, but a thing I could do and share with others. The initial defensive response I would have when people said, oh, you make things look pretty, was usually to double down and defend, like, oh, but the beauty is important, there are all these reasons why it has meaning. But that wasn't quite the right language to emphasize the value of design. And working in-house, working at a lot of technology companies, there's this sense that a lot of these companies know they need designers, but on a day-to-day level, they have maybe a fuzzy sense of what design can contribute. And it's really hard as a designer to maybe like come out of school or come out from self-education and have these lofty ideas, and then you get stuck in a role where it's like, okay, you're polishing stuff. That's really not the kind of role I aspired for. I think that's not something that many people aspire to do, is like having this little box, like you stay in your designer lane and do that. And this bit of self-reflection is from a designer working in tech, Mills Baker, and what he's emphasizing here is that design should not just present itself as doing the pretty things, but push on the outcomes, the user behaviors, basically the shared goal and the shared project that everyone else on your team is working towards. When I think about what I want people to consider the role of a designer as, what I can contribute to a project, what I can contribute to a common purpose, and I think about how I might be valued, I'd like to think of it as, this is our designer. She makes our product easier to understand, responsive to user needs. And importantly, like feeling that my role as a designer can connect to something that pushes the world ahead. Maybe it's using design as a lever to make people more productive, more capable, more empowered. And so a lot of how I've tried to communicate that to people who are non-designers that I work with involves drawing from other disciplines, pulling that multifaceted sense of what literacy is into my design work, and trying to translate the things I do into terms that other people can respond to that resonate with them. So this is some of the work I do at Palantir, and for engineers, what I've realized is that they'll often worry about things in terms of performance, how fast computers can process information, and an engineer might have their anxieties about like, okay, we can draw this chart that's clear and legible for maybe 10 data points. Can we do it for 1,000 or millions? Can we do it in a few seconds so people can get that information, or can we do it in minutes and then it won't be usable to anyone, it won't be meaningful? And so I've tried to have that framing when talking to them, and I'll say, you know, people have a limited amount of visual attention, using that language of performance. And they'll say, if I overemphasize this, they won't be able to pay attention to this other element or this other bit of information on the page. Or I might talk about how the visual complexity of a UI I'm working on doesn't help people process the information. And so I want to advocate for a redesign because it helps people understand content more efficiently. But I think that this type of language, this way of like pulling maybe from someone's quantitative awareness or from their kind of like verbal literacy awareness and trying to translate design work into that, is something that's really valuable in a lot of disciplines. And it's nice to feel that kind of like as I've jumped from wanting to be, you know, medieval historian back in the day to creative writer, computer scientist, and now as a designer, that all that time was not wasted work, but it's something that I can continually bring into my design practice and share with others. So that's my experience with bringing interdisciplinary influences into design. Really excited I got to share this with you, and thank you.
What are some of your hobbies right now? It seems like you have a lot going on. And
Yeah.
how do your hobbies maybe like inform or just allow you to escape all these passions?
I think a big one is just like reading as much as possible. Goodreads has become my favorite social network of the year. I think one thing I've taken up as a big hobby is that hopefully you can tell that I'm really excited by the idea of translating like design and the value of it and sharing it with others. And so a lot of what I've been doing more recently has been trying to find communities or programs that are bringing design and bringing technology skills to underserved communities, or communities of kids who are excited about it but don't have like excellent resources in their schools, and trying to teach that to people so that, you know, like maybe you have 100 kids who are just like searching for their next hobby, but maybe you teach a workshop about UX or design to them, and then like one kid there becomes really excited, that becomes their like mission in life. And so I think I have this personal interest in like sharing design, like in terms that are suitable for younger audiences, older audiences, but also just sort of like getting people excited about the same things I'm excited by.
Right. Well, and I'm sure in that process, like mentoring my residents, like to create their own magazine, it's like I get to see it come to life, but also I'm learning so much all over again from them doing it for the first time.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea of like reciprocal learning as well, and I think reverse mentorship too. I think probably the way that you have approached design maybe is like an important thing to remember. I don't know. I wanted to talk about sort of reciprocal learning as well, and how, because I think it's an experience that a lot of in-house designers experience when you're talking about like sometimes being the only designer in a meeting or a conference room, and sort of what tips or tricks you have in having those conversations, because you sort of spun it as like I'm the expert automatically, which is like super cool, but I think it's hard to have those conversations when you're educating at a very basic level, right?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I am in that position now where I'm the lead designer, which is a fancy way of saying only designer, on my product right now. I think one thing that's really interesting and humbling is like, so on one hand, because I was self-taught in design for so long, I didn't really have this sense of like how much context there is around understanding design, speaking design, like just basic things like how you critique work or like weigh different options. I think that's something that I've had to be mindful that like the team I work with is super thoughtful and super invested in this, but I need to frame things in the right way, and I need to realize that like the fact that they don't have the right terminology or context shouldn't put a barrier to how they can participate in my design process. So I think there's this aspect of like, kind of like humbly reaching out and trying to repitch my ideas to them and make sure they feel included in their design process.
Do you have an example or any anecdotes about like watching someone's light bulb go off through your visual literacy of explaining it?
Yeah, so I think one practice I've started doing is that I've started whiteboarding a lot more ideas on this kind of like really large, like rolly wheel whiteboard. And when I talk to an engineer who's maybe working on a feature that I'm designing for, I'll roll up this whiteboard to them and I'll draw out different concepts and I'll try to give a sense of like, okay, here are the options I'm weighing. These are the different visual indicators that I might use to clarify or understand something. And so I think there's something really accessible about not throwing kind of like this very like clearly polished design object to someone who's not very visually literate, because they look at it, they don't know how to decompose it. They don't know like, okay, I'm supposed to be critiquing like the type now or like the information hierarchy now. So I'll start with a whiteboard and I'll go like, okay, I have this option, I have this option, here are the concerns I'm weighing. And I think that getting people to see design as like this very like crude process initially, where I'm just drawing boxes and I'm like rearranging them in different orders, has been helpful in getting people to participate. Is that kind of answering your question?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it sounds like the way you've talked about design for you evolving as things you see to things you do, to things you share, a lot of that is how people interact with it and experience it as well as you're sharing it. And in that, like, I want to talk about infographics a little bit and how, like, because I have a really complicated like relationship with them. I feel like they aren't always the most useful. My thesis was on like the value of them, the value of information design, and how sometimes they can overcomplicate information and data, right? And how, I guess, do you have thoughts on that? How do you overcome that?
Yeah, so one thing I think is really interesting about infographics and information visualizations as a designer is I think it's really easy to get into this egocentric mode as a designer, where you look at the information, you think that like, my job is to make this so beautiful, it will knock people out, it'll be super dazzling. And sometimes I look at visualizations that I make or that others make, and I realize that we could have done something very simple, like just like a bar chart with like very kind of like straightforward labels, and that would have been the most communicative option. So I think there's an aspect here where like I think that information graphics for me are the most visible sense of like where I have to humble myself and realize that the outcome is not going to be the most beautiful design, but it's going to be the most effective design. And so sometimes that means that I like load up on the like really fun, cool, flashy ideas, and then I slowly subtract them and subtract them and subtract them. And I have to realize that the fact that the thing at the end feels more boring is not really a detriment. It actually means I'm creating something that's the most legible and clear and meaningful to people. So I think, it's very humbling for sure to realize that like sometimes loading on more design means something that's like not quite the right thing for people to consume.
Yeah, and maybe bouncing off that to ask the same question I asked Jordan, how do you measure impact in your work and in your work environment as well?
Yeah, so I think one big thing I've been thinking of, and this goes to kind of the discussion of like having design as something you can share, bringing other people into this sense of visual literacy, is that I don't just want to design artifacts that kind of like go out into the world and sit there, but I want to kind of empower my team or the people around me or like the organization I work within to create those artifacts without me. I don't know if there's a good way of describing this, but I think that distributing the design work I do, so it's not just like I'm the expert and I'm creating this thing and it would have never happened without me, but making sure that like all these sorts of like everyday moments where people are going like, like I need to implement this button, like where is it going to go? They have some sense of design literacy or design awareness. What was the original question again? I feel like I rambled a bit.
How you measure impact. I think you're talking about like people retaining and really understanding a message, which is what sort of spawned the question. But I think that that's also interesting to sort of be invisible in art design and really almost make it as if it's like just apparent, or like it should be that way already, which is kind of is hard, I think, as designers too, who want to sort of showcase our work and take credit for what we do and put our name like on things, when really it's the real value, I think, a lot of times is when we aren't present.
Yeah, I think the impact there to me is maybe like feeling like other people have learned about design through me, or that they participated in the design process as non-designers through me. And so in a sense, I'm like communicating things to them. I'm kind of like helping manifest like their ideas into like a deliverable, into a specific product that looks and acts in a certain way. But they're also like designing it with me.
And how had you approached design in a more traditional sense, the way you talked about discovering it later? How do you think your relationship with it today would be different?
Yeah, this is a hard one. I think I sometimes dream about kind of doing other design disciplines, like doing editorial design, doing like a lot of print design. And I think that if I'd done design classically, where I was more exposed to like the history of design early on, that would have been the thing I fixated on, is kind of like, this is like the type of design work I want to do. So that's like maybe one aspect. I think that a lot of my focus on like communicating across disciplines probably comes from feeling like an outsider to design for a while, and kind of feeling like I couldn't like get the right education early on, or I was always like trying to pick up these topics or skills that other people seem to know already from their classes, but I didn't have. And so I think that having felt like an outsider for so long, I'm really excited by this idea of bringing other people in and kind of expanding like what design means, or like how open design is to others.
I have a hunch that you're probably not the only one in the room who sort of found design in a similar way. So thank you.
Okay.